Hello and welcome to Planet America's Off the Planet with all the extra bits, bonus stories and interviews that we didn't have time for on the air. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello. And John, you broke some news in the show.
Well, yes, a scooplet of sorts, I suppose.
Yeah.
Jason Miller, Trump advisor, telling me that he's convinced that Donald Trump is going to run for president again in 2024, seeking to become just the second American president to be elected to two non-consecutive terms. The first being...
Grover Cleveland.
Yes. Whose real first name was?
No idea.
Stephen Cleveland.
Why would you cause have Grover if your first name was Stephen?
Because it's Stephen Cleveland, and it sounds...
guess so.
Anyway, so Donald Trump is seeking to become that. But what was interesting about that was I asked Jason Miller about, well, where does that leave Ron DeSantis, who is seen as the most likely alternative to Trump? Does he not run if Trump is going to run, or with all of the kind of legal things swirling around Donald Trump, and the possibility that even though Trump is a prohibitive favourite right now, so was Jeb Bush in 2016. So, you know, a lot of early front-runners tend to fall over once the primaries begin. Maybe at some point in the next 2 years, Republicans move on. Now, he said DeSantis is going to run whether Trump runs or not. That was interesting. He also made a really interesting comment about thinking that Trump and Biden are both kind of, you know, tied at the hip in a sense, that both need each other. If Trump doesn't run, then he says Joe Biden will not run. But he's been telling Trump, Miller's been telling Trump, get it announced soon, probably in the new year, that you're running, and that will force Joe Biden's hand. It will make him announce what his intentions are, and that Joe Biden still has it in the back of his mind that he alone can beat Donald Trump. That was his rationale in 2020. So he thinks that he can get Joe Biden to lock in to running for re-election when maybe he's on the fence by Trump getting into the race sooner rather than later. But the other kind of bit of news...
Well, hang on. Before we go into that one, let's talk about this first bit first.
Sure.
Because there's a lot of news to break down.
Yeah.
For a start, I completely agree with Jason Miller's analysis. I do think that Trump needs Biden and Biden needs Trump. I think basically, I mean, this is just my opinion, the only person that Biden can beat in an election is Trump, and the only person that Trump can beat in an election is Biden. And so they
paradox, Chad.
They kind of need each other, and they're both convinced that they're each other's, you know, enemy of sorts. And so I do think that his analysis is correct in that respect, and it's going to be really interesting in a primary between DeSantis. And he said he worked with DeSantis as well. Yeah. So he knows a little bit about him. Yeah. DeSantis and Trump primary could be really interesting. And they're already starting to get a bit snippy with each other. So it might be coming soon.
The thing about Ron DeSantis, though, Ron DeSantis, before he was governor in Florida, he was a member of Congress. He was a House member. And he didn't have a great reputation. Not as a member of Congress, not as particularly as a speaker. He didn't have fantastic fundraising. It was only when he ran his very Trumpy campaign for governor a couple of years back that he suddenly rocketed into national attention. And then, of course, his handling of the coronavirus pandemic, which kind of, you know, he was basically erring on the side of letting it rip and not having mandates and lockdown requirements and so on, that made Ron DeSantis a real hero of the Trump set. But DeSantis, to me, at this point, it could be very wrong. We'll look back at the tape in a few years and see how wrong I was. Ron DeSantis is another one of these candidates who looks good on paper. The idea of Ron DeSantis running for president seems great, but he's not that charismatic. He's young. He doesn't come across as particularly kind of, you know, it doesn't have a lot of gravitas, not particularly authoritative. I suspect that Trump would probably quite like to run against Ron DeSantis. The only question in my mind is, how soft does DeSantis run? Because if he wants to run to be Trump's VP, that's an open slot right now, and it makes him heir apparent in 4 years. So maybe that's the better play for Ron DeSantis. So he runs, but he runs a little bit soft against Trump. That's a possibility.
If he wants to be VP for Trump, he needs to run real soft because Trump holds a grudge. Yeah. So it's interesting what you say, man. He does like a sense of humour, I think, which is one of Trump's greatest strengths, I feel.
A lack of a sense of humour.
like Trump is entertaining. Trump is entertaining. Trump is funny.
But it's not on purpose. Trump doesn't tell jokes. He never laughs.
He doesn't. Well, that's true. That's true. He doesn't do gear, but he does. I mean, like I've watched enough of his rallies to know that at times. I mean, there's a certain sneering kind of school bully nature to his humour, but it's still there,
Right.
and people who like him love it.
Sure.
And DeSantis has
It's
none
like
of that.
going to see Don Rickles in Las Vegas.
Yeah, there's no showtime about DeSantis at all. But anyway, let's get on to what you were about to drop. The other bit of news from...
Yeah, so Jason Miller also said Trump's dream Democrat rival, the one that he absolutely wants, is Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
But yeah, I think that's highly unlikely.
Yeah.
He said the one that Trump should fear the most is Gavin Newsom, governor of California.
Which is interesting.
Very interesting. Partly because, in a sense, he's kind of he looks like he could be a member of the Trump family. He was married to Don Trump Jr.'s now girlfriend, Kimberly Guilfoyle.
That's really weird.
She's a former Mrs. Newsom.
Yes.
Gavin Newsom is interesting. He's not a particularly progressive California governor. He's regarded as a more moderate, centrist Democrat.
He's done plenty of progressive stuff, though.
He has, and that has people kind of going, well, he's governing as a progressive. He's seen typically as being a moderate.
Yeah, in the past, yeah.
In the past, and particularly when he was, he was mayor of San Francisco. And, San Francisco has had some quite progressive leaders at different times, and Gavin Newsom was not that either. He comes from a business background. So, you could imagine Gavin Newsom actually being a Republican. The big problem, of course, is California has sent Republican governors like Ronald Reagan to the White House in the past. Richard Nixon was from California, but that was when California was a Republican state or a swing state. California is now deeply, deeply blue. It's got a big population. It's got Silicon Valley. There's a lot of money there for donors, but it's really hard to get a national profile out of California. And being a candidate from California doesn't win you California. California has already won, which is why arguably Michigan's Gretchen Whitmer would be a better governor as presidential candidate, you would think. But according to Jason Miller, for what it's worth, he thinks that Newsom actually fits the profile of a generational change that people would go, rather than a rematch of Trump or Biden, maybe we want somebody who just is a break from the past and offers newness.
I think him and DeSantis would actually be a really interesting contest
interesting.
because I think actually they've got a lot in common. I think they're both clearly pragmatists, like they're both sort of details kind of guys, but at the same time they've tried to reinvent themselves, both of them, as culture warriors.
Yeah.
And like Gavin Newsom has certainly spent the last few years trying to set himself up for a presidential run with ridiculously over-the-top culture warring. Like, for instance, as part of his election campaign, he's been taking out ads in Florida.
Yeah, and Texas too.
Yeah, well, he's put up billboards in Texas saying to Texans, come and get an abortion in California, essentially, which is just trolling. Now he's just trying to get attention. And he's challenged DeSantis to debates for reasons I don't understand. And he's trying to get people's attention. So I think he's certainly on the make, trying to run for president. I don't think he'd run against Biden. But if Biden steps down, I think he'd definitely run against Harris.
Now, that's a big question because, of course, Kamala Harris's political base is also around San Francisco, as is Nancy Pelosi as well. There's a familial connection between Gavin Newsom and Nancy Pelosi too. And depending on whose report you read, Gavin Newsom would either definitely not run if Kamala Harris is the likely nominee, or definitely would run because they hate each other. So different assessments as to whether those two would crowd each other out. Would they cancel each other out? There's a good chance that we don't know what the primary schedule is going to be. Typically, in the last couple of decades, California has been one of the last primaries, in as late as June. But with the reordering of the primary and caucus schedule expected for the next primary season, certainly on the Democrat side after the debacle in Iowa last time, the expectation is that California is going to be a lot earlier than it's been for a long time, which would make its big delegate haul very, very important. So even if it's not necessarily that important in the general election, it could become a king or queen maker in a primary race. So it's going to be very interesting to see. And I'm not sure that Jason Miller is right to say that Gavin Newsom is potentially the strongest candidate against Trump. But I think he's the candidate that people who support Trump would recognise. He's a slick, middle-aged white guy.
Yeah.
And so I think they would see him as much a threat because they see themselves in him, as I think they just wouldn't understand a Cory Booker candidacy or an AOC candidacy.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've continued to think that the strongest general election candidate the Democrats have on their bench is Cory Booker, but I just don't think he's ever going to win a primary, which is a bit of a shame for the Democrats. But but having said that, I think Newsom would be a strong candidate, but I just don't see how you get from the start of a campaign to the end of the campaign if you're a Democrat and you're a white man when the vice president is a black woman. Yeah. I just don't see how that happens. Like it's at some point in time, the Democrats are going to need to confront that, and I don't think that's going to work out well for Gavin Newsom.
At the very least, though, cast your mind back to Hillary Clinton's primary win in 2016, and there were 4 other Democrats, as well as Bernie Sanders, Jim Webb, Link Chaffee, somebody else. Who was the other one? I can't remember. But they didn't discourage a competitive primary, even though Hillary Clinton was the presumptive nominee, because they felt it's good batting practice. Oh, Martin O'Malley.
O'Malley.
Martin O'Malley from Maryland.
Yeah.
So they thought it was good for Hillary Clinton, who's not a great campaigner, as a warm-up, give her a gently competitive primary involving a few of those other people, none of whom were really likely to be the nominee. O'Malley looked good on paper as well. And you can see how Democrats would say, well, Kamala Harris had a lousy primary campaign in 2020 before she dropped out. She probably needs a competitive primary, even if she is seen as the Hillary-style presumptive nominee. It would help her to actually go on the campaign trail, to have 20 primary debates, to have to go out, raise money, meet voters and so on. And it gives us an insurance policy. If she does implode again, we want her to implode in Iowa, not in October.
Absolutely. Look, I wanted to talk a little bit about hurricane and flood insurance of all things, but I'm just conscious of the clock. So we might come back to that. But while we're talking about Kamala Harris, I did tease on the show that I had a malarkey coming up on this. And I'd like to just talk about this now, because this clip flew around the internet the other day and it's really picking up. I've seen it. I had Fox on in the background the other day and they basically talked about it like 4 times in an hour, just going on and on about. This clip started, I think, trying to trace it, I think it started from that reliable news source on Twitter, End Wokeness.
It's my go-to.
This is what they said. The text was, Kamala on Hurricane Ian relief. The Biden administration will focus on giving resources based on equity by directing funds to community of colour. This was the clip.
It is our lowest income communities and our communities of color that are most impacted by these extreme conditions and impacted by issues that are not of their own making. And so women. Absolutely. And so we have to address this in a way that is about giving resources based on equity, understanding that we fight for equality, but we also need to fight for equity, understanding not everyone starts out at the same place. And if we want people to be in an equal place, sometimes we have to take into account those disparities and do that work.
Okay, so you see how it starts awkwardly and it ends awkwardly, both halfway through a thought. Whenever I see that on a clip on Twitter, I think, oh yeah, let's go find the original source. There's usually a reason it was clipped out halfway through a thought on either side. And but before I actually show you the result of that search, that clip was then sent around by a lot of conservatives. It was picked up by Christina Pushaw, who's DeSantis's rapid response director, and she played that, and then she said, "This is false. Vice President's rhetoric is causing undue panic and must be clarified. FEMA individual assistance is already available to all Floridians impacted by Hurricane Ian, regardless of race or background." And then she had the phone number to call if you need some assistance. Fair enough, right? It's actually just say, let's not have any confusion here. Anyone can get hurricane aid. It's not based on race. Okay. She then kept on tweeting about it 6 or 7 times. Now, I don't know if that's because she was really worked up about potential misinformation or if she was just trying to get the clip out there. I suspect more the latter because she's often a troll. But it really got out there at that point in time. A lot of people going about it. Now, so I found where the clip came from.
Yeah.
It came from a Democratic Women's League Forum interview with Priyanka Chopra Jonas interviewing Kamala Harris. And honestly, this was one of the longest hours of my life going through this particular interview. It was a terrible interview. And it went on and on and on. And this is actually part of the problem of trying to fact check this kind of stuff. It takes forever to show you the full context. It only takes a second to show you the misinformation. So this is actually a shortened version of the question. The question went for 2 minutes. Right. This is the second half of the question that Kamala Harris was answering.
You and the administration obviously are working around the clock right now to support relief efforts in Florida and to prepare citizens as Hurricane Ian now is closing in on South Carolina. So extreme weather conditions like this are becoming obviously more frequent and more severe, and I wanted to acknowledge the administration for passing the biggest climate legislation in history earlier this year, because it is a fact that America's leadership sets an example to other major economies around the world which are truly dragging their feet when it comes to doing their bit. So can you talk just a little bit about the relief efforts, obviously, of Hurricane Ian and what the administration has been doing to address the climate crisis in the States? And just a little follow-up, because this is important to me. We consider the global implications of emissions, right? The poorest countries are affected the most. They contribute the least and are affected the most. So how should voters in the US feel about the administration's long-term goals when it comes to being an international influencer on this topic?
Okay, so that was just the second half of the most painfully incoherent, lengthy question I've ever heard. How do you answer that question? The answer is badly. Kamala Harris is wandering all over the place. It was a 4-minute answer where she just dealt with all kinds of stuff all over the shop. I'm just going to take a minute on either side of the grab to show you the context of the answer. Yes, I know this is boring, but it is important. It's important to actually get the context of this to understand why it's misinformation. This is the relevant part of their answer.
The crisis is real and the clock is ticking, and the urgency with which we must act is without any question. And the way that we think of it and the way I think of it is both in terms of the human toll, and I know we are all thinking about the families in Florida, in Puerto Rico, with Fiona, and what we need to do to help them in terms of an immediate response and aid, but also what we need to do to help restore communities and build communities back up in a way that they can be resilient, not to mention adapt to these extreme weather conditions, which are part of the future. On the point that you made about disparities, you know, when I was District Attorney of San Francisco, I was elected in 2003. I started one of the first environmental justice units of any DA's office in the country focused on this issue, and in particular on the disparities, as you have described rightly, which is that it is our lowest income communities and our communities of color that are most impacted by these extreme conditions and impacted by issues that are not of their own making. And so
women.
Absolutely. And so we have to address this in a way that is about giving resources based on equity, understanding that we fight for equality, but we also need to fight for equity, understanding not everyone starts out at the same place. And if we want people to be in an equal place, sometimes we have to take into account those disparities and do that work. But also, I will say, as a former prosecutor, part of this issue also has to be about enforcement and where appropriate, making sure that the bad actors pay a price for what they do that is directly harming communities in terms of their health and well-being.
Okay, so you can see she does mention hurricane relief at one point in time, but broadly she's talking about climate change. That's what she's talking about, addressing climate change, okay? And it took us, 5 minutes of clips to explain that, which makes it impossible to fact check on television or in any way that anyone's going to take in. And so the lie just gets out there and it stays out there and it's never, ever, ever. I've seen reporters try to deal with this honestly and they just can't explain it in time.
Right.
Like, because they only have 20 seconds. And that result of that is on her record. That's a stain on her record. And I bet we're going to be hearing about this when she runs for president. Still.
Yeah.
People can say, oh, she tried to politicise hurricane relief and make it about race.
Yeah, and how effectively she pushes back against something that is clearly false will be one of those markers as to how good a candidate she's going to be. But there's no point in being the presidential nominee up against Trump or DeSantis or whoever if you can't make it very, very clear. I was talking about global inequity as well as local inequity, but it was about climate change, not about this particular hurricane relief program. So, yeah, that's going to be a test for her. Kamala Harris and the facilitator in that we're talking about the size of the climate change bill that the Biden administration and Congress through the Democrats passed earlier this year. That is one of those things that when Democrats say, well, what has Joe Biden achieved? They say, well, look, there was the infrastructure, there was bipartisan, so you get it done, but you don't get singular credit for it because there was buy-in from across the aisle. There was the COVID relief, and there was the remnants of Build Back Better, including those climate measures, which were pretty big beer, and yet, as Celinda Lake told us on last week's Planet America, you speak now to voters, and they don't remember anything that happened more than about a month ago.
That's absolutely true. I've got the numbers here. The Washington Post poll, 57% of people say now that Biden has not accomplished much or anything.
Yeah, right.
So not getting a lot of credit there. That is, and I've got the numbers, by the way. It is a bit silly because it's talking about total bills rather than the size of the bills. But Biden's enacted 173 public laws as of August 22. 129 of them were deemed substantive, compared to Trump in the same period. 236 public laws, 171 of them substantive at the same stage. So that's less than Trump. Both had unified Congresses. Biden had Sinema and Manchin. I would suggest it's harder to get stuff past them than Trump. Trump struggled to get past McCain, Murkowski and Collins. But I think that's comparable, even though Trump was ahead.
Yeah.
Certainly not nothing. And there were some big bills there, some huge bills. The Recovery Act in itself was a massive, massive bill.
Yep.
As you say, Infrastructure Act, what else? The CHIPS Act. There's been a few big bills.
Yeah.
And he got no credit as well for averting a massive train strike a couple of weeks ago, because it's one of those things where when the entire economy doesn't go kaput, no one notices, because it didn't.
Yeah.
But it would have if they hadn't averted that train strike at the last second.
And unfortunately, for Biden, some of the big measures that could have had a long-term difference to people, it often takes several years for things like the Affordable Care Act to flow through to people's lives. And again, it's like, well, you've kept your health insurance, but then the problem isn't you can't get health insurance, it's the cost of health insurance.
Yeah.
And so you create a new problem, you just sort of create the problem further down the line. In the case of some of Biden's, the child tax benefits, the fact that he wanted that to be ongoing, Joe Manchin said, I'm only going to support this for a couple of years. So it goes away again, just as people are getting used to it. And so it then just becomes a short-term government handout that was frittering away billions of dollars rather than something that changes society and changes families and their ability to work and get childcare and all sorts of things.
I think you're right, people have a short attention span. Like I saw a poll from Third Way where when the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act passed last year, hugely popular. It was in the 60s, right? This was in June this year. Less than about a quarter of less than a quarter of people remembered it existed. In June this year. That was like 9 months after it was enacted. So the people just forget. Are you of the view?
And also partisan media, there's nothing for them in a bipartisan infrastructure bill.
That's true.
Except to say, and because they can't even just say, oh, this is more profligate Democrat spending if you're on Fox News. So you do move on because there's no political heat there.
Are you of the view that policy doesn't matter at all for midterms? Because you look at 2010, the Democrats lost 63 seats after passing the Affordable Care Act and the Recovery Act and Dodd-Frank Act, etc. In 1982, Reagan lost 27 seats after the big tax cut and the military reforms and stuff. 1965, the Democrats lost 47 seats after passing Medicare and Medicaid. Like, is it a case that policy doesn't matter, or is it a case that whenever you do something big, there's a bit of a thermostat effect where people just move against you?
Yeah, look, I think that's, it's the delayed gratification of a policy that is going to change healthcare, but not yet. But Obama's big problem in 2010 was that the United States was still very, very slowly recovering from the global financial crisis. And so that's where big items like the Affordable Care Act can play against you, because, well, okay, we're still struggling to get jobs and you're focusing on healthcare. You should have fixed the economy first, pal.
Yeah.
And then you know, we'll go and look at healthcare. And there were people, including, you know, Biden and others, who were arguing maybe you've got your priorities wrong. Obama saw that there was a very narrow window to have that 60th Senate vote in order to get the Affordable Care Act through, and he was right. Yeah. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. But yeah, I mean, you look at historically some of these big midterm losses. In Reagan's case in '82, America was in a recession in '82. It came out of the recession in time for him to handily win re-election in '84, but that was an economic cycle thing. People were feeling that pain, just as a lot of Americans are feeling the pain now. Obviously, Biden is hoping that with gasoline prices coming down, unemployment still staying low, inflation seeming to be moderating or at least hit its highs, they may just get a sense of, in the next couple of weeks, things are getting better, not worse. Wall Street is tanking in the meantime, so maybe that's not going to work in their favour. So
maybe not.
Yeah, so I think it's got more to do with the fact that people live in the economy every day, and policies affect either other people, and therefore I resent the fact that money's being spent on them, or it's not affecting me today. This is a few years down the track.
I agree. Do you want to talk about Congress quickly before we get to the end?
Yes. So very easy to think that Congress never gets anything done. Sometimes they do. US Congress does seem very likely to pass changes to the Electoral Count Act. This is all in an effort to avoid a repeat of Donald Trump's attempt to hijack the presidency back in 2021. You'll recall that Trump had been pressuring Mike Pence, the vice president, not to recognise the certification of the Electoral College, which had formalised Joe Biden's election victory. And that Trump mob that attacked the Capitol building on January 6th last year, chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," they set out to disrupt that certification proceeding.
Trump's supporters had erected a gallows on the lawn in front of the Capitol building.
Now, the extent to which Donald Trump and his associates orchestrated that violence, of course, and whether they broke any laws in doing so is the subject of congressional investigations and plenty of court cases as well. But a bipartisan group of moderate senators headed by Republican Susan Collins and the aforementioned Democrat Joe Manchin has been working on changes to the original Electoral Count Act from 1887 at a time that the House has also passed a bill. The Presidential Election Reform Act, PARA, has now passed that chamber. It aims to remove any question that the VP is needed to validate an election. It also makes clear the VP cannot change the result, which Trump reckoned he could, instead of just one House or Senate member being able to call on a debate over the results. The House bill requires a third and the Senate bill wants 1/5 to be able to just have a debate to question any of these results. It also creates a federal court process for the candidates if state governors don't certify the result in their particular state. Now, only 9 Republicans supported the bill when it passed the House last week. All of them are leaving Congress, including Liz Cheney.
Our bill reaffirms what the Constitution and existing law make plain. The Vice President has no authority or discretion to reject official state electoral slates.
But in a major boost to the hopes of passing a final bill, this week Republican Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell gave his blessing to a more modest Senate version.
But the chaos that came to a head on January 6th of last year strongly suggests that we find careful ways to clarify and streamline the process.
He's always exciting. And it's not just Mitch McConnell that they've got on side. They've also got 11 Republican senators supporting the Senate bill, which, along with the 50 Democrats, that's enough to overcome a filibuster. So they're going to pass the bill if they want. I think that's going to happen. The House bill, by contrast, has a few problems. Has a couple of rather unsubtle swipes at Trump in it, like hefty court fines for candidates who file election-challenging lawsuits without, quote, a good faith basis for their challenge. Pretty obvious who that's referring to. So it's hard for me to see any Republicans who don't have a death wish signing on to that. Bottom line, I reckon the Senate bill is going to get up after the election, which is a relief that they're going to close that loophole, thank God.
Yes, speaking of death wishes, Donald Trump accused Mitch McConnell of having a death wish this week when McConnell passed the stopgap spending bill, which avoids a government shutdown. They were cutting it pretty fine, though. It passed the House less than 12 hours before funding was set to lapse. So they've kicked that can down the road until mid-December. So we're now going to be talking about a shutdown in time for Christmas.
Yeah, and there's a few other things they need to deal with before the end of the lame duck session after the election. They need to deal with the Afghanistan Adjustment Act, and what that does, very, very briefly, is the tens of thousands of Afghanistan refugees that they took last year being classified as humanitarian parole. It's a way of getting around the fact that no one gets refugee status these days in America. They only last for 2 years, and then they're in legal limbo. They've got nowhere to go, nothing to do. So the Afghanistan Adjustment Act will allow them to have a path to citizenship eventually after vetting. So that's an important one, and that's going to get up, I think. It's sponsored by Lindsey Graham, who knows how to sniff the wind. So I think that's going to happen. And the other one is the Respect for Marriage Act, which is basically it's a law that says that if someone has a same-sex marriage in a state which doesn't have same-sex marriage being legal has to recognise that. And the reason for that is because right now same-sex marriage is only guaranteed by Supreme Court case. There's concerns the Supreme Court might change their mind at one point in time. Whether you believe that or not, it's good for Congress to have a safeguard just in case. And so that's what the Respect for Marriage Act's about. There's 4 Republican sponsors of that at the moment. I think it's Murkowski, Portman, Tillis and Susan Collins. No big surprises there. 4 is not enough. They need 10. But they did put off till after the election because the Republicans said we can get 10 votes after the election. If you don't make us vote on it before November. Exactly. If we vote before November, it will become politicised, and then we'll have to oppose you. They didn't say that, but that was the hint. But afterwards, they can sneak it in. So I'm optimistic about that, but we'll see. There might be a bit of Lucy in the football taking it away after the election. We'll see.
We will see.
Indeed. That's what, anything else to say about Congress before I go to defence?
No.
Okay. All right. So let me tell you about the interview that I teased during the show. It was about defence, and basically what it was about was the American military aid to Ukraine is in the form of these rocket launchers, and they're not getting them for years because it's going to take that long for America to build them. And there's been a lot of talk recently that maybe the American defence isn't quite as resourceful as we have grown to think it is because they spend so much money. Maybe they're actually short in a lot of critical areas. So I spoke to Stacie Pettyjohn to ask her about this. She's the director of the defence program at Washington-based think tank, the Centre for a New American Security. And this is what she had to say. Stacie Pettyjohn, welcome to Planet America.
Thanks for having me.
So Stacie, in your opinion, just how under-resourced is the US military right now?
I don't know if it is a lack of resources. I think the U.S. Department of Defense has had challenges reprioritizing where it is spending and aligning the resources that it is given with the types of capabilities it needs given the threats that it faces or anticipates facing in the future.
Now, people at home are going to be listening to this and going, what? How is this possible? America spends more than the next 9 countries combined on defence. Is there something that America is spending too much on, maybe, in defence?
Well, there are a lot of capabilities that folks would say are less relevant. This is the term of art the Biden administration's using for the future conflicts that the department's planning to focus on. The 2022 National Defense Strategy has identified China as the pacing challenge and Russia as an acute threat. And so it's continuing the shift that began in 2018 to focus on great power competition and conflict and preparing the US military to shift from decades of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operations. And during those decades, the US did not undertake a number of significant modernizations of its conventional forces and its nuclear forces. And right now it's facing a situation where it needs to upgrade its conventional military forces and the entire nuclear enterprise. And so this is a pretty hefty price tag, but part of the problem and what I've argued, and the administration claims, is that they need to be able to divest of some of the less relevant systems that wouldn't be as useful in a conflict with China or Russia, so that they can reprioritize and rebalance their portfolio of investments towards capabilities that would help them to win a war against China and ultimately, hopefully, to deter that war from ever occurring.
So would you say China and Russia are the only countries that America is vulnerable to at the moment?
No, absolutely not. There are a whole host of other persistent threats, including North Korea, Iran, potentially extremist organizations, terrorist organizations. You still see ISIS sort of lurking about in the Middle East and other parts of the world. So there are a number of other threats that America still needs to manage. But the administration has made it quite clear that those are no longer the priority, and therefore it's seeking to focus its investment efforts and acquisition on new capabilities that help U.S. forces to be linked up together so that they can pass information to each other and launch long-range precision standoff strikes, so that they're survivable in the face of adversaries that are much more capable than the ones that the United States and its allies have been facing for the last several decades in the Middle East and Central Asia.
All right, so let's take Ukraine, for instance. Is the aid that America is currently delivering to Ukraine actually compromising America's readiness for war?
It is cutting into U.S. munitions and missiles stockpiles fairly significantly. So there are limits on the production capacity of the defense industrial base in the United States. It has, like the rest of the defense enterprise, been optimized for efficiency. So there is not a lot of redundancy or resiliency within it right now. And that means it can't surge to meet this unexpected demand of what the Ukrainian forces are needing, which far exceeds what anyone predicted in terms of missiles and munitions in particular, but also they're looking for air defenses, for tanks and maneuver vehicles, and for rocket launchers. And so right now, the administration has been consistently drawing into its own stockpiles to provide the Ukrainians with these weapons. And as it is promising more and more, you're seeing that the lead times for Ukraine to actually acquire them are lengthening as well. You're looking at 6 months to several years to get the next batch of HIMARS rocket launchers that it has been using incredibly successfully for deep strikes against Russian forces, in particular logistics nodes and headquarters. So yes, there is definitely a bit of a zero-sum game here. What is being given to Ukraine cannot be maintained for American forces. Some of the capabilities are probably less relevant, especially if the United States is thinking about defense of allies and partners in the Pacific, because the ranges are just so different. So in Ukraine, they're fighting a ground war where they're much closer in, and you can use shorter range systems like artillery rounds that are 155 millimeters and such. And that's probably slightly less in demand in the Pacific, where the US is looking at very long range missiles that can be fired from great distances, so it can remain outside of Chinese capabilities that could damage US forces.
And are you saying that even though America might be short of HIMARS missiles, it's the long-range weapons that are the real issue, yeah?
Well, those are in shorter supply because they're more expensive, so we haven't bought as many of them. Typically, the U.S. Department of Defense and the services have tended to deprioritize missiles and munitions. They are what defense officials consistently refer to as the bill payer in the budget process, meaning that when it comes down to racking and stacking what's going to be included in the budget for any given year, you can't buy half of an airplane or half of an aircraft carrier or a ship, but you can reduce the buy of missiles and munitions, often fairly significantly. And that routinely happens, which means the US doesn't have enough large enough of stockpiles for its own needs, let alone for providing it for allies and partners. On some of these shorter range systems, or medium-range systems like Gimlers, which are the rockets that the Ukrainians, we don't know exactly how many the U.S. has provided them. They haven't specified the number, but they're the ones fired by HIMARS. And the U.S. stockpiles were probably in the range of about 30 to 50,000 before what we had given Ukraine. So it's hard to say since we don't know how much has been given, but I do know that we can only produce about 10,000 of those a year. And at the rate of expenditures that we're seeing the Ukrainian forces, they're just firing these missiles quite rapidly. We are probably unable to meet their demand and maintain a fairly robust stockpile for US forces at the same time.
Okay, the government's spending, what, $800 billion on defence per year at the moment? Some Republicans are saying they should be spending $1.2 trillion. How much do you think America needs to spend on defence per year to deal with this issue?
I think that they're within the bounds that if they made more difficult choices and actually cut some programs that are not going to be as useful for preparing to fight against China, that the U.S. could reallocate some of those resources. The squeeze has gotten worse with inflation. That is really hurting the Department of Defense's purse. But in reality, despite the enormous amount of money that the U.S. Department of Defense has in its budget, a relatively small portion of that is what we would call the investment budget, where they can move around to buy new weapons or invest in new technologies. A huge amount of it is tied up in military personnel, which have been growing faster than the rate of inflation for a number of years. And that's going to increase with inflation right now. And then in military operations and sustainment. And those costs have been high because of the ongoing wars in the Middle East, but also because of the increasing age of a lot of US weapons. A lot of its aircraft and its ships and its tanks are fairly old. And to keep them operating effectively, they require longer periods and more maintenance, which costs more. So a huge chunk of that enormous sum of money that the Department of Defense is getting is sort of sequestered and tied to those other missions and not to investment. That being said, I still don't think that enormous amounts of additional funds are needed. What the department has to do is break with some of the programs that have strong constituencies on the Hill and make some of the investments in new technologies that are needed to enable these new warfighting concepts based on information dominance that they've developed.
So are you saying in the long run, America needs a smaller army in terms of personnel in order to upgrade their technology? Or are you saying close down some programs, open up some programs?
I'm saying both. I've argued that there do need to be force structure cuts, and you're seeing across the services, the force is shrinking just because weapons are getting more expensive and people are getting more expensive. I do think the Army potentially should have more cuts than the other services because it is the less central service for any fight in the Pacific region. Ultimately, this is one of the things that the promise of artificial intelligence and autonomous systems could provide, which is replacing some of the humans right now that the US requires to do a lot of things with machines that ultimately don't cost as much money.
Stacie Pettyjohn, thanks for visiting Planet America.
Thanks for having me.
So that was Stacie Pettyjohn on an issue that I think is going to grow because a number of Republicans are looking to increase the defence budget a lot.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, but like the proverbial battleship, these things don't turn around in a big hurry when it comes to defence procurement. Yeah. Now, that is all for Off the Planet for this week. If you missed this week's Planet America, you'll find it on iView, YouTube and Facebook. And if you didn't miss it, we'll just watch next week's episode instead when it comes along. But for now, goodbye.
See you later.